Well, hello again. One more session here with British literature of the 19th century. And we're getting towards the end of the 19th century, and pretty soon we're going to be just moving right into the 20th century and talking about modernism. But in the meantime, we are still considering some of the greatest of the great Victorians. And at the end of our last class, we had begun a discussion of Robert Browning's Fra Lippo Lippi. And just to once again establish a kind of context, remember one of the things that we were talking about with Browning was the way in which he was experimenting with poetic form, and in particular with the dramatic monologue. The dramatic monologue being a poetic form in which we are listening to the voice of a speaker. This need not be the poet himself or herself, but the voice of someone speaking, and presumably there is someone else who is responding to the speaker who is speaking. But we can only infer what that other person says or does from what the speaker says, because we don't actually hear the other person. Now, in the case of Fra Lippo Lippi, you'll notice that there is some variation on this pattern, which again bespeaks the experimentation that Browning is going through here. So, once again, you'll recall that at the end of last class, I was talking about how Fra Lippo Lippi is a poem really about art and about aesthetics, and there was a whole debate about aesthetics toward the end of the 18th century, and then certainly through the 19th century, continued into the 20th century. Aesthetics being what? What is aesthetics? Anybody want to hazard a definition of aesthetics? Yeah, go ahead, press your button there.
It's how something can stand the test of time.
Yeah? How?
Can last so many years and still be considered good art.
Good art, okay, and good art. Because notice that it's really an investigation of what constitutes art, and then of course the value judgments that we make about art, right? To distinguish, as you said, good art from art that may, if not be bad, may be not as good as other art is, and so forth. So aesthetics has to do with a discussion, a theoretical discussion of what constitutes art in the first place, and then it addresses questions of value and how we make value judgments in talking about the arts. Now, that became a central preoccupation of the 19th century, and there were all sorts of people who even developed philosophical views based on conceptions of beauty, some kind of transcendental Platonic notion of beauty. And we've seen a little bit of this in the Romantics, but it was something that was developed particularly by philosophers who were interested in aesthetics, the most important of whom was Hegel, the German philosopher Hegel. And he actually based a whole philosophical system on an analysis of beauty with a capital B. But in any event, we have lots of writers who are going to be interested in questions of art and qualitative questions about the arts. And we're going to see that not only in Browning's poem Fra Lippo Lippi, but we're also going to see that particularly in Ruskin, but then again in Arnold in yet a different way, and we're going to see a new kind of practice of the art of poetry in someone like Gerard Manley Hopkins toward the end of our period this evening. So, going back to Fra Lippo Lippi, remember that he was a painter, he was a monk, so he was officially a member of a religious community in the church, and he lived at a time right at the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Italian Renaissance. And so he's right on the cusp, as we sometimes say. And what he's doing is he's considering the differences in art between medieval art, which in the argument he presents here is based on the assumption that the body does not matter. The only thing that ultimately matters is spirit. And if the only thing that ultimately matters is spirit, then what should the artist do? What should the painter do? I mean, clearly the painter should not be absorbed with the presentation of the individuality of the individual figure, especially as represented by physical things. You know, we look around and we look at one another and we're, you know, all different sizes and shapes and colors and, you know, physiques and so on and so on. Some men, some women, some older, some younger. We all have individual features and individuating features, and some of those are features of personality, but obvious ones, if we were talking about painting, would come into play with individual and individuating features of how we look, right? Well, is that what a painter should do? According to Fra Lippo Lippi, that's what a painter should do if one is devoted to the concept that the only thing doing, the only worthwhile activity in human life is giving up the things of the body and cultivating the spirit. You see, what kind of art then should you produce? What kind of painting should you produce? Well, you could produce a kind of painting which is relatively abstract, which does not pay attention particularly to the individual physical features of the people in the painting, that your painting should exist to provoke certain kinds of ideas, so that you would have not only lots of religious painting that would be designed to provoke religious feelings and religious ideas, but these could even be treated allegorically, so that a figure would not simply be a figure, let's say, of a woman, but that figure of a woman might stand for temperance or justice or grace or something like that. In other words, an abstraction, so that even in the representation of the woman in a painting or in sculpture, one would really be featuring the abstract qualities of the figure. Now, as you know, in the Italian Renaissance, and then as the Renaissance in art spread throughout Europe, there was a contrary kind of movement towards a celebration of physical beauty, based on the assumption that everything around us is God's creature, and God's creatures must be inherently beautiful. And we can experience that beauty in the beauty of creation, even in its physical manifestations, or perhaps even especially in its physical manifestations. Certainly for painting at any rate. Well, that's the kind of conflict that exists in this poem. So at the beginning of the poem, as we talked about last time, Fra Lippo Lippi has sneaked out of the monastery, and apparently he's gone to visit a woman down the end of some lane. So we're definitely dealing with a worldly monk. And now he's been stopped by, the equivalent of police officers. There wasn't an official police force here, but the equivalent of a kind of system of guards who want to know what he is doing out in the middle of the night. Is he up to no good? And of course, they don't have any idea at first of who he is. And so he's saying, look at me, look at my, don't put your torches right in my face. can't you see who I am? Don't you know who I am? And so forth. And notice that this is the dramatic monologue, right? He is the one speaking. We don't hear what the guards have to say, but we can infer their words and their actions from what he says. And then as we go along to line, say, 39, he says, yes, I'm the painter, since you style me so. Yes, I'm the painter. That's who I am. Don't you know now? And then, he talks about how there's a carnival going on. There are bands playing music. There are people dancing. And all of these things have drawn him out into the streets, rather than simply being sequestered in a cell in his monastery. And so he says in lines 46, 47, and I've been 3 weeks shut within my mew, a painting for the great man, saints and saints and saints again, his patron. And he refers, by the way, at different times to having a wealthy patron, Cosmo de' Medici, who is one of the most famous people of the day, and also an enormously powerful figure, not only in Italy, but also in Europe generally. And he has felt it necessary, that is to say, he, Fra Lippo Lippi, has felt it necessary to escape from the monastery, at least for the time being, to the call of the world, real life as it is lived by real people. And so, as he says in line 64, there was a ladder. Down I let myself. He got out. Well, okay. And he's looking around at the guards by the torchlight, and he's thinking, hey, this one could be a model for this painting, or that one could be a model for that painting. And then he tells us in line 81 and following how he got into the monastery in the first place. I was a baby when my mother died, and father died and left me in the street. I starved there. We're talking about a time when there weren't any child protective services, so that this orphan child is simply left to fend for himself. And what did he do? He ate garbage, as he tells us. Fig skins, melon parings, rinds, shucks, refuse, and rubbish. And what happens to him? Well, he gets grabbed by Aunt Lepetia, who trussed me with one hand, and so along the wall over the bridge and straight out to the convent. And so to the good fat father, who apparently is a priest, perhaps an official in this religious house, who now speaks. So notice, at this point, the dramatic monologue is still dramatic, but it's no longer a monologue as such. So, boy, you're minded, quoth the good fat father, wiping his own mouth. 'Twas refection time, that is to say, the time when the monks would eat. To quit this miserable world, will you renounce? And of course, what he's going to be asked is, will you renounce the world in order to join the monastic community? Because the whole point of entering into a monastery was to withdraw from the world. No one was compelled to become a monk. But you could join the monastery as a way of living a life of austerity, cultivating the life of spirit, and giving up the pleasures of the body, generally speaking. And he's thinking, of course, this is the young boy who's starving out there. Will you renounce? A mouth of bread, thought I? By no means. Brief, they made a monk of me. So he thinks, well, these guys are eating. I'm not. If that's what I have to do to get a good meal, sure, I'll renounce the world. I'll become a monk. And he did this all at, as he says in line 101, 8 years old. So at 8 years, what kind of a resolution can this really be? Well, okay. He thinks, hey, look, I found in time, you may be sure, 'twas not for nothing. The good bellyful, the warm serge is a kind of cloth. The warm serge and the rope that goes all around is a kind of belt. And day-long blessed idleness beside. Well, of course, what the monks are supposed to be doing in that, what appears to him to be idleness, is praying. But of course, for him, that's a time to lounge around and take it easy. But then, of course, they insist on trying to teach him Latin, and of course he hates that, and he hates the discipline of trying to learn Latin. And so what does he do? He draws instead, draws in the sense of drawing with a pencil. Okay, so that in 129 and following, I drew men's faces on my copybooks, scrawled them within the antiphonaries marge or margin, joined legs and arms to the long music notes, found eyes and nose and chins for A's and B's, and made a string of pictures of the world betwixt the ins and outs of verb and noun. On the wall, the bench, the door, the monks look black, etc. Okay, so see what he's got here is he's got the chant book. The monks are famous for their chants. And they have these large books, quite large books, by the way. And each page will not only have the notes on it, the musical notes, but will also have the words that are being chanted according to those musical notes. But what is he doing? He sneaked a pencil in, and he's drawing on the book, on the chant book, so that, look what he's doing. Joined legs and arms to the long music notes. Found eyes and nose and chin for A's and B's written in the book, and so forth. Nay, quoth the prior. The prior would be the head of the monastery. Nay, quoth the prior. Turn him out, do you say? In no wise. Lose a crow and catch a lark. Lose a crow and catch a lark. Hey, rather than expel him, why don't we take advantage of the artistic talent that this kid has? And so what do? They turn him loose. They give him a wall on which he's going to do a fresco. A fresco is a painting which is done on plaster. And some of the most famous Renaissance works of art are frescoes. Often, by the way, in churches, monasteries, convents, and the like. So notice what he does is he is preoccupied with a kind of realism in his painting, in depicting the everyday world of real people, which from the point of view of the prior and the other monks is to depict the world of the flesh, which is precisely what they believed they were getting beyond. So, the prior and all of the learned monks object to what he's doing in 174 and following. How? What's here? Quite from the mark of painting, bless us all, faces, arms, legs, and bodies, like the true as much as P and P, It's devil's game. It's devil's game. If you make the body appear beautiful, you're going to make people desire physical beauty rather than want to transcend their bodies to cultivate the life of spirit. That's the whole argument against him on the part of the prior and the other learned monks. And that's a devil's game. Your business is not to catch men with show, with homage to the perishable clay being a biblical reference to the body and how the body was originally formed in Genesis. But lift them over it. Lift them over the body. Lift them over physical reality. Ignore it all. Make them forget there's such a thing as flesh. Your business is to paint the souls of men. Man's soul, and it's a fire, smoke. No, it's not. It's vapor, done up like a newborn babe. Well, give us no more of body than shows the soul. Here's Giotto with his saint appraising God that sets us praising. Why not stop with him? Why put all thoughts of praise out of our head with wonder at lines, colors, and whatnot? Giotto, have any of you seen pictures of Giottos or reproductions of pictures of Giottos? Typically what you'll have is you'll have a face, but that face may not be differentiated from other faces in the same or similar paintings. In other words, it won't be individuated in the way that your faces are, my face is, and so forth. Moreover, you'll notice that the body usually is not shown really at all. There will simply be some robe completely covering the body so that the body is not only not seen, but you can't even tell what form it is. You can't tell whether the figure is large or small or tall or short or slender or whatever. Okay? So why don't you paint like that? You see? And simply give us a suggestion of a person which really leads us then to religious contemplation. Well, okay. So, in 2:16, he's going on now, thinking about this. You know, he's been asking, you know, is this really sense? Does this make sense? Does this make sense? And you say there's a body with no soul at all? I never saw it. Is there beauty with no soul at all? I never saw it. Put the case the same. If you get simple beauty and naught else, you get about the best thing God invents. That's somewhat, and you'll find the soul you missed within yourself when you return him thanks. Well, okay, so rub it all out. Rub it all out. That's what the prior wants. Okay? But then in 2:20, looks like 3, I'm grown a man, no doubt. I've broken down. See, I'm no longer a child. I've grown up. I'm a man now. I'm a mature man. And I've broken bounds. You should not take a fellow 8 years old and make him swear to never kiss the girls. I'm my own master. Paint now as I please. Having a friend, you see, in the corner house, which of course is his patron. Well, we go on with all of this, but the principal argument he makes comes up in lines 300 and following. For don't you mark, we're made so that we love first when we see them painted, things we have passed, perhaps 100 times, nor cared to see, and so they are better, painted, better to us which is the same thing. Art was given for that. God uses us to help each other so, lending our minds out. Now, what he's saying here is that we can pass something 100 times and never really see it. But it is the business of the artist to show us what is distinctive and even what is beautiful about that thing, about that person, about that object, about that building, about that tree. Okay? And so what he's arguing here corresponds very much to the argument that Coleridge made in his Biographia Literaria that we were looking at earlier on this term. And remember that Coleridge said that he and Wordsworth had divided up the different kinds of poems that they were going to write. And what Wordsworth was going to do was to take ordinary, natural things, the kinds of things that we could see and experience every single day, and to show through his poetry how extraordinary they are. That's the same kind of argument that Fra Lippo Lippi is making about painting here. Okay? So, we go on, and he's decided, by the way, that he's simply going to trick the prior and the other learned monks. He's going to create the kind of painting that they think they want, but he's really going to be incorporating into that painting his own perceptions of real people. Okay, so what we have then in this poem is not only an interesting poetical experiment, but we also have a focusing on one of the problems of aesthetics that very much concerned people in the 19th century. Because it wasn't simply the debate that they were carrying on among themselves about their own contemporary arts, but much of the argument was actually tied, as we're going to see in Ruskin, was actually tied to art history and how they saw the history of Western art. So that when we turn to Ruskin, one of the things we're going to be talking about is how the art historians and other cultural historians put down the Middle Ages in order to promote the values of the Renaissance and of the whole early modern movement in the arts in the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries. And that became the basis for the kind of argument that you find here in Fra Lippo Lippi, right? To leave behind, Fra Lippo Lippi says, the aesthetic of that earlier age and embrace the new aesthetic which was emerging to become the aesthetic of the Renaissance, in which, according to him at any rate, though according to many art historians and cultural critics of the 19th century, this was the point at which there was a celebration of humanism, a celebration of humanism, of that which is human, including the body, our physical nature, as well as our spiritual and intellectual nature. Okay, so let us turn over now to Ruskin. If we can go to the screen for a moment, please. You'll see here that Ruskin lived a long life, and he was very successful in his time. He, among other things, became one of the most famous art critics and architectural critics of the 19th century and was enormously influential. And he went around lecturing. He not only lectured at Oxford, but he also lectured elsewhere in England and really all around, and was a major, major cultural figure in his time, and much lionized by his students and by others who were interested in the arts. So, let's look first of all at his work, Modern Painters. Modern Painters. And I'm going to take you through part of the selection that we have in our text in just a moment. But you'll notice that painting is seen here as an expressive language. Okay? You've heard the phrase, the language of images. We often use that when we're talking about, say, movies or pictorial advertisements or any kind of visual images which are intended to be expressive in the way language can be expressive. To express certain kinds of feelings, to express certain kinds of ideas, perhaps. Okay? So that, you pick up any glossy American magazine and you look, say, at the advertisements. And what are those visual images trying to express? Well, you will be truly a successful person if you can afford to have a BMW or a Lexus or something or other like that. Just like the people in the picture next to this beautiful car, who are themselves beautiful people dressed in beautiful attire, perhaps with beautiful jewelry. And these are the kinds of people who not only yearn to possess, but in fact do possess this automobile. In other words, the visual image is itself a kind of language, a kind of expressive language. Or you can have something else. I don't know how many of you remember this or not. Some of you probably aren't old enough to remember this. But during the Vietnam War, there was a very famous image of a naked little girl running down the road, and behind her, her village is all in flames. Now, what does that image say to us? Or what did it say to us then, in that time and in that context? Okay? So what Ruskin is talking about is that you can have a language of images, a language of visual images, and that these can be expressive in the same way, or at least in a similar way, to language being expressive. But then notice he's going to follow that up with another claim that the greatest painting is that which conveys to the spectator the greatest number of the greatest ideas. So that we go and we stand in front of the painting, or in our time perhaps the photograph, or the motion picture. And the greatest would be that which is capable as an expressive language of conveying to us the greatest number of the greatest ideas. Now, who gets to decide? Well, that's a very interesting question, isn't it? And clearly Ruskin is going to put himself forward as one who can decide. And Ruskin, of course, was very much interested in education, as people in the 18th and 19th centuries came to be, because it was largely through education that you would not only form the intellect of your students, but you would also be forming their characters in some kind of ethical sense, or at least educators hoped they were, and you were forming their aesthetic sensibilities. In other words, their taste. By exposing them to good music, by exposing them to good art, by exposing them to good books, you see, they would acquire a taste for those things. And so, therefore, you will find that a number of these people actually were professional educators. You know, as Ruskin. Ruskin was a famous professor. Okay, so for him then, that's going to be very important. And then we're going to get to his practical criticism. It's all well and good to talk about these things in theory. But how about practice? How do you actually go about applying Ruskin's principles to a particular painting? And he's going to be doing this with Turner's Slave Ship, which is a very famous painting. And in being the first one really to articulate, as he did, what he called the Pathetic Fallacy. Now, we'll talk about what those things mean in just a moment. But let us first of all turn to the selection from modern painters. And look first of all at his definition of greatness in art. His definition of greatness in art. Painting, or art generally, as such, with all its technicalities, difficulties, and particular ends, is nothing but a noble and expressive language. Okay? I mean, you can talk about the technicalities of painting. You can talk about things like perspective. You can talk about things like light and form, contrasts, movement within the painting, and so forth. But ultimately, painting or art generally would be a noble and expressive language, invaluable as a vehicle of thought, but by itself nothing. Notice he doesn't value the painting per se, the painting itself, as valuable. But he values what the painting can do to us. He who has learned what is commonly considered the whole art of painting, that is, the art of representing any natural object faithfully, has as yet only learned the language by which his thoughts are to be expressed. Okay? Ruskin had studied painting. I mean, studied, the actual techniques of painting paintings. He didn't become a painter himself, by the way, but he did become a great critic of art. He has done just as much towards being that which we ought to respect as a great painter, as a man who has learned how to express himself grammatically and melodiously has toward being a great poet. The language is indeed more difficult of acquirement in the one case than in the other, and possesses more power of delighting the sense, while it speaks to the intellect. But it is, nevertheless, nothing more than language. Yes, it's true that we may be delighted by painting, but at the same time, it's really nothing if it doesn't invoke or provoke in us certain kinds of thought. Nothing more than language. And all those excellences which are peculiar to the painter as such are merely what rhythm, melody, precision, and force are in the hands of the orator and the poet, necessary to their greatness, but not the tests of their greatness. It is not by the mode of representing and saying, but by what is represented and said, what the respective greatness either of the painter or the writer is to be finally determined. Okay, so he goes on. So that if I say that the greatest picture is that which conveys to the mind of the spectator the greatest number of the greatest ideas, I have a definition which will include as subjects of comparison every pleasure which art is capable of conveying. Well, okay, but what does all of this mean in practice? Okay, look at the end of that paragraph. But I say that the art is greatest which conveys to the mind of the spectator, by any means whatsoever, the greatest number of the greatest ideas. And I call an idea great. Aha, we've been waiting for this, haven't we? You know, what are you really talking about? The greatest number of the greatest ideas? Well, what makes an idea great? That logically is the next question we have to ask, isn't it? Because on the definition of greatness, everything hangs. And I call an idea great in proportion as it is received by a higher faculty of the mind. By a higher faculty of the mind. Higher faculty of the mind than what? Then presumably is involved simply in a kind of emotional response. Higher intellectual response, a higher imaginative response. And as it more fully occupies, and in occupying, exercises and exalts the faculty by which it is received. In other words, it cultivates the faculty that is brought into play by the work of art. Let's just take the notion of imagination. For him, a great painting would appeal to one of our higher faculties, let's say in this case imagination, and as it cultivated our powers of imagination by drawing in us through imagination, it would be demonstrating its greatness. Notice once again that his focus is not simply on the artwork as object and the value of the artwork as object, but it is rather on the subjective value of the work of art in us as subjects who experience the work of art. Does that make sense, what I just said? Okay. Okay, if this then be the definition of great art, that of the great artist, okay. Up till now we've been talking about, well, what constitutes great art? Well, what about a great artist? How do we know that someone is a great artist? Naturally follows. He is the greatest artist who is embodied in the sum of his works, not just in one, but in the sum of his works, the greatest number of the greatest ideas. Well, okay, well that does seem logically to follow, but still it leaves us wondering perhaps what that might add up to. Okay, so then we turn to The Slave Ship, which is a very famous painting by Turner. I don't know how many of you have seen Turner's paintings, but Turner's paintings are not all like this, but some of the most famous of his paintings, as described by Ruskin. By the way, Ruskin promoted Turner's reputation as an English painter. And Ruskin is in large part responsible for our regarding Turner as a really important artist, not simply of the 19th century, but an important artist, period. And characteristically, what he will do in his paintings is that there will be this play of light and dark. So there will be darker figures in the painting, but then there will be some kind of what Ruskin called a central luminescence. That is to say, some kind of light, maybe in the sky, maybe, somewhere up there, or, in the center, or coming from a side, or whatever it is. But that is really, for Ruskin at any rate, what draws the eye and becomes the center of the attention of the viewer. But I think the noblest sea that Turner ever painted, and if so, the noblest certainly ever painted by man. Ever painted by man. I mean, that's a very large claim, isn't it? To jump from saying the noblest painting that Turner ever did, jumping to say the noblest painting ever painted by anybody, is that of the slave ship, the chief Academy picture of the exhibition of 1840. The Academy is the Academy of Arts. It is the sunset on the Atlantic after prolonged storm, but the storm is partially lulled, and the torn and streaming rain clouds are moving in scarlet lines to lose themselves in the hollow of the night. The whole surface of sea included in the picture is divided into two ridges of enormous swell, not high nor local, but a low, broad heaving of the whole ocean. Okay? This is after a storm. Like the lifting of its bosom by deep drawn breath after the torture of the storm. Between these two ridges, the fire of the sunset falls along the trough of the sea. The trough is in between the waves, right? Dyeing it with an awful but glorious light, the intense and lurid splendor, which burns like gold and bathes like blood. Along the fiery path and valley, the tossing waves by which the swell of the sea is restlessly divided lift themselves in dark, indefinite, fantastic forms, each casting a faint and ghastly shadow behind it along the illumined foam. They do not rise everywhere, but three or four together in wild groups, fitfully and furiously, as the understrength of the swell compels or permits them, leaving between them treacherous spaces of level and whirling water, now lighted with green and lamp-like fire, now flashing back the gold of the declining sun, now fearfully shed from above with the indistinguishable images of the burning clouds, which fall upon them in flakes of crimson and scarlet, and give to the reckless waves the added motion of their own fiery being. Purple and blue, the lurid shadows of the hollow breakers are cast upon the mist of night, which gathers cold and low, advancing like the shadow of death upon the guilty ship. The guilty ship. This is the first time he's introduced a word like that, right? Up to this point, everything has been a description of what the picture looks like, right? But now notice the guilty ship here. As it labors amidst the lightning of the sea, its thin masts written upon the sky in lines of blood. And now this is beginning to make sense, isn't it? Blood, the guilty ship, the gashes, the storms, the terror, the blood-like rids, and so forth, girded with condemnation. condemnation of that guilty ship, in that fearful hue which signs the sky with horror, and mixes its flaming flood with the sunlight, and cast far along the desolate heave of the sepulchral waves, like sepulchres where people are buried. Incarnadines the multitudinous sea, which is a line out of Macbeth. I think that's in our note. I believe if I were reduced to rest Turner's immortality upon any single work, I should choose this. Its daring conception, ideal in the highest sense of the word, is based on the purest truth. Greatest ideas, right? And wrought out with the concentrated knowledge of a life. Its color is absolutely perfect, not one false or morbid hue in any part or line, and so modulated that every square inch of canvas is a perfect composition. Its drawing is accurate as fearless, the ship buoyant, bending, and full of motion. Its tones as true as they are wonderful, and the whole picture dedicated to the most sublime of subjects and impressions, completing thus the perfect system of all truth which we have shown to be formed by Turner's works, the power, majesty, and deathfulness of the open, deep, illimitable sea. Yes, and within this, the guilty ship. Because, of course, after all, the ship is a slave ship. Okay. So, this is an example of what Ruskin can actually do, in practice, in applying his theory. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that, we all have to become devotees of Ruskin, but it is a way of approaching art. And this was, as I've said, very, very influential in the 19th century. And Ruskin had a huge following, especially as he grew older. He attracted many, many, many younger students. Well, I'm not going to go through the pathetic fallacy in detail, except just to tell you that the basic idea is that Ruskin was disturbed if you have a depiction of nature in which nature is personified, as if nature had human qualities. If we say, for example, nature weeps or the skies weep, you see, what are you doing? You are, in effect, personifying the sky as if it were a human person capable of weeping. And Ruskin was very much opposed to that kind of thing, and he called it the pathetic fallacy. Well, once again, this is simply another instance in which Ruskin is attempting to put into practice some of his criticism. Okay, flip over to the selection we have from the Stones of Venice, which also was a very famous and very influential work. Now, he's going to take the word Gothic and he's going to analyze that. He's going to analyze that in some detail. And he's going to say, as we might say nowadays, that this needs to be deconstructed. We need to take it apart. We need to unpack all of the different meanings and values associated with this term so that we really know what we're talking about. Now, up until Ruskin's time, the term Gothic was actually a disparaging term, a negative term, a derogatory term. It was used to describe some kind of barbarism. Remember, from a Roman point of view, who the Goths were. The Goths were one of those peoples who came sweeping down through the Roman Empire and eventually tore apart the Roman Empire. Well, okay. Here's Ruskin. I am not sure when the word Gothic was first generically applied to the architecture of the North. And by the North, he means Northern Europe. Okay? But I presume that whatever the date of its original usage, it was intended to imply reproach. It was intended to be negative and express the barbaric character of the nations among whom that architecture arose. Okay? People in Ruskin's time did not really have a very high value, generally speaking. I'm not talking about exceptional people, but generally speaking, people did not have a very high estimation of Gothic art and Gothic architecture. Examples of which you find in the great medieval cathedrals, you know, like Notre Dame and Chartres and so forth. And he goes on. It never implied that they were literally of Gothic lineage, far less that their architecture had been originally invented by the Goths themselves, but it did imply that they and their buildings together exhibited a degree of sternness and rudeness. Rudeness, as in crudeness, which, in contradistinction to the character of southern and eastern nations, such as Renaissance Italy, or the great Byzantine cathedrals and so forth, in contrast contradistinction to the character of southern and eastern nations, appeared like a perpetual reflection of the contrast between the Goth and the Roman in their first encounter. And when the fallen Roman, in the utmost impotence of his luxury, look at that, in the utmost impotence, not a good word, of his luxury, not a good word, okay, and insolence of his guilt, this is the Roman now, became the model for the imitation of civilized Europe at the close of the so-called Dark Ages. Not the Dark Ages, but the so-called Dark Ages. The word Gothic became a term of unmitigated contempt, not unmixed with aversion. Okay? In other words, in the Renaissance, for example, what after all was the Renaissance supposed to be a renaissance of? Right? I mean, that's a real question. I mean, the word Renaissance means rebirth, doesn't it? And to have a rebirth, you have to have a rebirth of something that previously existed. Right? So what was the Renaissance supposed to be a renaissance of? Any... Well, no, to move beyond the so-called Dark Ages. Yeah. Did you have a...
It was supposed to be a hearkening back to the golden age of reason and enlightenment and thought and just the age of beauty and wisdom.
Right. Associated particularly with what?
The Greeks and Romans.
In history, sorry?
The Roman Empire and the Greeks.
Yes, the Greeks and Romans.
Times, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The great glorious age of Greco-Roman civilization, as you say, with its rationality, with its science, with its mathematics, with its art, with its love of beauty, and so on and so on and so on. Great literature. Okay? So that's what the Italians claimed that they were reviving in what they called well, this is not the Italian word for it, it's the French word, but it's the French word that stuck, the Renaissance. Okay? And notice that the very concept of Renaissance denigrated or put down everything in between Greco-Roman civilization and the so-called Renaissance of the 15th and 16th centuries. In other words, 1,000 years or more of Western civilization came to be relegated to the Dark Ages. Okay? Or, not quite as bad, the Middle Ages. Now, can you imagine somebody in the 12th century saying, gee, isn't it interesting to live in the Middle Ages? Middle between what and what? See, the very concept of Middle Age or Middle Ages in history and in historical terms is to say, well, that was just a kind of Middle Age. That was just a kind of time out, as it were. A kind of intermission, unfortunate intermission in the history of Western civilization between the great period of the Greeks and the Romans and now the rebirth of the glories of Greece and Rome in Renaissance humanism. Okay, now what Ruskin is going to do is he's going to take that whole argument and stand it on its head. He's going to say, the real golden age was the Middle Ages. And the greatest of our architecture is to be found in medieval, what people popularly like to call Gothic architecture. And his argument's going to be very interesting, how he develops that. But let's just look at the end of that paragraph. It is true, greatly and deeply true, that the architecture of the North is rude and wild. But it is not true that for this reason, we are to condemn it or despise. Far otherwise. I believe it is in this very character that it deserves our profoundest reverence. It's precisely its crudeness. It's precisely its wildness. It's precisely because of these qualities that we should revere so-called Gothic art and architecture, according to Ruskin. So you'll notice, if we can go to the screen now, that this is a form of cultural criticism, as we'll see it developed. It's a form of cultural criticism. And I'll be talking more about that as we go along. Because what he's going to do is he's going to use the kind of art and architecture produced in the ancient world, in the Middle Ages, and in the modern period as indices of what kinds of cultures existed in those times. In other words, the premise here of his argument is that you can tell what kinds of values a culture has or has had by looking at its art and architecture. So that his critique of the art of the ancient, medieval, and modern worlds is going to lead him to his critique of the cultures of antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the modern world. Okay? And this begins with a critique of the Gothic as a term of cultural disparagement, promoting the ideology of enlightenment and progress, as if, oh, well, we're just so far advanced beyond those people. Why, look at their cathedrals. with all those wild things in the cathedrals, you know, and the sculpture on the cathedrals and inside the cathedrals and so forth. Look at all that stuff. Okay. So we're going to look now at systems of architectural ornament or expression. So let's turn over, and I realize that we're dealing with different editions here. So what I'm doing now is I'm going over 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs. To the paragraph that begins in the 13th and 14th paragraphs of chapter 21 of the first volume of this work. Everybody with me? There's a short paragraph which begins, if, however, the savageness of Gothic architecture. You got that?
Yes.
Okay, the one that immediately follows that. Okay. What page are you on in your edition?
1434.
1434, and that's which edition?
The 7th.
The 7th edition. Okay. So for those of you who have the 7th edition, it's on page 1434. Okay, he begins by reminding us of something that he had mentioned earlier on. In the 13th and 14th paragraphs of chapter 21 of the first volume of this work, this is a multi-volume work, it was noticed that the systems of architectural ornament, properly so called, might be divided into 3. Servile ornament, and this is very important, servile ornament, in which the execution or power of the inferior workman, not that the person is inferior, but that the person is treated as an inferior in the society, is entirely subjected to the intellect of the higher, of the person higher on the social and political scale. In other words, the actual art is produced by somebody who is in a servile position, is a slave or a servant, who is told what to do. Secondly, constitutional ornament, in which the executive inferior power is to a certain point emancipated and independent, having a will of its own, yet confessing its inferiority and rendering obedience to higher powers. So you now give a little bit more space to the person who is actually doing the carving or putting on the brushstrokes, but still that person is subjected to a higher power on the social scale. Okay? And 3, revolutionary ornament, in which no executive inferiority is admitted at all. In other words, in which the people who produce the work of art are not directed by anybody who oversees them at all. In other words, they are free to create as they will. So then he goes on, says, I'm going to explain this at greater length. He says, of servile ornament, the principal schools are the Greek, the Ninevite, and Egyptian. Now this is amazing. It was ancient art that was so highly prized and praised during this period. And he's saying this is really the lowest form of art. Now why? What's that based on? But their servility is of different kinds. The Greek master workman was far advanced in knowledge and power above the Assyrian or Egyptian. Neither he nor those for whom he worked could endure the appearance of imperfection in anything. And therefore, what ornament he appointed to be done by those beneath him was composed of mere geometrical forms, balls, ridges, and perfectly symmetrical foliage, which could be executed with absolute precision by line and rule, and were as perfect in their way, when completed, as his own figure sculpture. In other words, what he's saying here is that in Greek sculpture, a lot of the work was assigned by the master sculptor to people who were in subordinate positions, and whose job was simply to follow out exactly and with the highest possible precision the directions of the master sculptor. Now, one thing we know, by the way, about a lot of earlier painting and sculpture, and of course this would have to be true of architecture, is that while there would be one person who would design the whole thing, there would be lots of assistants who would do parts of the work. That was even true of paintings, by the way. You know, you'd have the master painter who would come up with the design for the whole, but then, you know, the sky, I mean, the master painter's not going to sit around and do skies, or clouds, or trees, and so forth. You know, those are turned over to assistants who, you know, come in and do those things. And each one has his own task, possibly her own task. We don't know to what extent women were involved in some of these artistic activities. So, he goes on. You know, what of their humanity do these people have the freedom to express? All they can do is follow the rules that they are given. Okay, but in the medieval, in the next paragraph, or especially Christian system of ornament, this slavery is done away with altogether. This slavery is done away with altogether. What on earth is he talking about? Christianity, having recognized in small things as well as great, the individual value of every soul. Okay, and so here we have the argument, which is a common enough argument, but certainly Ruskin gives it very special treatment here, that Christianity was new in the value that it gave to every single person, regardless of where the person comes from, regardless of what the person's station in life may be, regardless of what the person's talents or occupation may be, that every single person is valuable. But it not only recognizes its value, it confesses its imperfection in only bestowing dignity upon the acknowledgement of unworthiness, which of course is the whole notion of sin and of acknowledging one's imperfections, that itself is very highly valued within Christianity. Okay, and so what he says then, in the last sentence of that paragraph, is, and it is perhaps the principal admirableness of the Gothic schools of architecture, that they thus receive the results of the labor of inferior minds, and out of fragments full of imperfection, and betraying that imperfection in every touch, indulgently raise up a stately and unaccusable whole. Now, what he means by that is that the Gothic cathedrals were actually made by communities of people. And you would have hundreds of people from the local community who would be working on the structure, and it was rare for them to complete the work within somebody's normal lifetime. Chartres, for example, is usually regarded as a miracle in its construction because that great cathedral was constructed in a period of about 30 years. But in many cases, It would take 100 years or more to build one of those cathedrals, in which you literally would have generations of people working on it. And in many cases, these would just be ordinary people from the local town. And they would be given the freedom, according to Ruskin, to express themselves to a large extent as they would, even their imperfections. And he's going to say, therefore, that that's the kind of culture which places the highest value on human beings, because it places the highest value on human freedom in spite of its imperfections. And more about this after we take a break.